Imagine the cold air above Germany on December the 20th, 1943, a sky torn by war, where survival often hung by a thread. In that frozen chaos, a Luftwaffe pilot eased his Messerschmitt Bf-101 up alongside a shattered American B-7 bomber. Through the bomber's broken windows, the American crew could clearly see him, and he saw them, injured, exhausted, barely keeping their dying aircraft aloft. One short burst from his guns would end it. His finger hovered on the trigger. He'd already sent several planes spiraling to the ground that day. One more victory would secure him the Knight's Cross, the highest honor a German pilot could earn. And yet, in that moment, Franz Stigler made a choice so unthinkable it could have cost him his life. He decided to spare them. Stigler was not some hesitant combatant, nor a man secretly longing for peace. He was a consummate fighter pilot, precise, disciplined, deadly. Born in Bavaria in 1915, he grew up in a world where aircraft were part of daily life. His father and uncle had flown in the First World War. Aviation ran in his veins. By the time the Second Global Conflict erupted, he had accumulated thousands of flight hours as a civilian pilot and instructor. When he entered the Luftwaffe in 1940, he was placed into fighter training under the guidance of some of Germany's most accomplished aces. Among them was Gustav Rodel, an officer whose lessons went beyond aerial tactics. Rodel taught Stigler the code of honor, how to fight without surrendering one's humanity. By December 1943, Stigler had already proven himself countless times. He had flown in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before being reassigned to defend the skies over Germany. He'd been shot down more than once, survived each time, and amassed 22 confirmed victories. At just 28, he was experienced, formidable, exactly the kind of pilot the Luftwaffe desperately needed as American bombers pounded German cities. But he remained a man who remembered Rodel's principle. You follow the rules of war, not for your enemy, but for yourself. You fight with rules to keep your soul intact. That same morning, December 20th, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched a massive raid on the aircraft factories in Bremen. Among the bombers was a B-17 named Olde, commanded by 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown on his very first mission as pilot. And almost from the outset, everything unraveled. German fighters tore into the formation. Olde took repeated hits from cannon fire. Engine number 2 was obliterated. Engine number 4 spewed oil. The electrical system began to fail. The oxygen system was destroyed, leaving the crew gasping from hypoxia in the thin air. Then came the next blow. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was killed instantly. Several other crew members were badly wounded. The nose of the bomber was smashed open. The tail section so violently damaged that the rear position was nearly sheared off. Holes big enough for a man to crawl through ripped across the fuselage. Yet Charlie Brown still managed to drop their bombs and turn the crippled aircraft toward England. But Olde had fallen out of formation, and over Germany, a lone bomber was a doomed one. Fighters routinely hunted isolated stragglers. The B-17 staggered forward at barely 2,000 feet, far below normal altitude, trying desperately to reach the North Sea. The crew braced for the inevitable. Their ammunition was almost gone, several guns destroyed, and they were effectively defenseless. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. Meanwhile, Franz Stigler had just landed at Yver Airfield to refuel after an earlier fight. Sitting in his cockpit, he heard ground crew yelling and pointing upward. A B-17 was crawling past the airfield at an absurdly low altitude. An easy kill, Stigler didn't hesitate. He took off at once. This would be straightforward. The bomber was alone, slow, heavily damaged. His Messerschmitt was fast, agile, fully armed. As he approached from behind, sliding into perfect position for the kill, he knew one more confirmed victory would earn him the Knight's Cross. This was his moment. He pulled alongside to verify the target and choose where to strike. Standard procedure. Get close, get certainty, then fire. But the sight that greeted him froze his hand. Through the enormous gashes in the fuselage, Stigler could see inside the bomber. He saw the dead tail gunner slumped in place. He saw the others, wounded, bleeding, still trying to perform their duties amid the wreckage. The tail looked so torn apart that he couldn't fathom how it still clung to the aircraft at all. The whole bomber resembled a machine fed through some monstrous shredder. Stigler looked into the cockpit and met the eyes of Charlie Brown, a young pilot fighting with every ounce of strength just to keep the B-17 in the air. In that fleeting connection, Rodel's lessons echoed in Stigler's mind. This wasn't an enemy war machine anymore. It was a coffin drifting through the sky, filled with men who were moments from death. Shooting them down would not be combat. It would be execution. And the code of honor was clear. You never fire on a man who can no longer defend himself. A pilot descending by parachute, or a crew trapped in a dying aircraft. You grant them their final chance at life. Imagine, just for a moment, that you are floating helplessly in the sky, suspended like a figure on a torn parachute, unable to fight, unable to flee. That was exactly the state of these men. The bomber they rode in could hardly stay airborne, let alone defend itself. And in that fragile instant, Franz Stigler made a choice that would echo across decades. He eased his fighter into formation beside the shattered B-17, drawing close enough that every American airman could make out the lines on his face. Picture yourself inside that battered Ye Olde pub, alarms ringing in your mind, exhaustion weighing on your shoulders. Then suddenly, a German fighter gliding right next to you. What would you think? The crew braced for the inevitable burst of gunfire. A few tried to operate their broken, nearly empty guns, but the effort was hopeless. And then Stigler did the unthinkable. He merely signaled. A wave of his hand, a pointed gesture toward the German countryside below. His message was unmistakable. Land. Save yourselves. But the Americans refused. They kept their course toward England, toward home. Stigler understood instantly. To land in Germany meant captivity. For men who had already stared death in the eyes, surrender felt like another kind of defeat. So Stigler made an even more astonishing choice. Imagine him sliding ahead and slightly to the side of the bomber, placing his own aircraft where anyone on the ground could see it. To observers, it looked as though he were escorting a German-controlled machine, not shielding an enemy. Yet that was exactly what he was doing, acting as a living barrier between the wounded bomber and the lethal German anti-aircraft guns that lined the coast and patrolled the waters. With a friendly fighter flying in formation, the gunners hesitated. They could not risk firing on what might have been one of their own. For several long minutes, they flew like this, crossing the German shoreline, heading out over the cold, gray waters of the North Sea. With every second, the danger to Stigler grew. If any superior officer discovered that he wasn't shepherding a captured aircraft but instead helping an enemy escape, the consequence was absolute. Court-martial and execution. Treason. No excuses. At the very edge of his fuel range, Stigler drew close one final time. Imagine the moment. Two pilots, each having survived what should have killed them, locking eyes through layers of glass and wind. Stigler raised his hand and delivered a crisp, formal salute. Not as German to American, not as enemy to enemy, but as aviator to aviator. Then he broke away, banking toward Germany and fading into the distance. Charlie Brown and his crew stared after him, astonished. How could they explain it? A German pilot and adversary had become the sole reason they were still alive. Ye Olde pub limped across the North Sea and somehow reached England, crash landing at an emergency airfield along the British coast. When the ground crew saw the wreckage, they were stunned that such a mangled machine had lasted more than a few minutes in the sky. The bomber was so thoroughly ruined that it never flew again. It was dismantled for parts. But every surviving member of the crew made it home. As for Franz Stigler, he returned quietly to base. He filed no report. He spoke to no one. Under German military law, what he had done was not compassion. It was a capital offense. Still, he resumed flying missions until the war ended, lived through the conflict, surrendered to American forces, and in 1953 began a new life in Canada, where he built a prosperous career. Charlie Brown survived the war as well. Back in the United States, he eventually became a diplomat and settled into a peaceful life. Yet both men carried a memory they could neither forget nor share. Charlie warned his crew to remain silent. After all, what would the U.S. military think if they learned their lives had been spared by a German fighter pilot? The questions, he feared, would be uncomfortable. So the story remained locked away. Stigler held the memory with equal silence. He had risked his honor, his career, and his life to save the men he was supposed to destroy. Speaking of it meant danger, even years later. The weight of that risk lingered. And so, for more than 40 years, two men on opposite sides of a brutal war guarded the same secret bound, not by nation, but by a moment of profound humanity in the skies over Germany. Imagine the silence of 1986, a world far removed from the roaring engines and tracer fire of the 1940s. Yet one memory from that brutal winter sky simply refused to fade. Charlie Brown, now an older man, found himself wondering about the German pilot who had spared him and his crew. Who had he been? Why had he chosen mercy when everything in that war urged the opposite? Driven by that unanswered question, Charlie published a notice in a Combat Pilot Association newsletter. In it, he described the encounter in detail and asked whether anyone might know the identity of the mysterious Luftwaffe pilot. That notice traveled farther than Charlie could have imagined. It reached Franz Stigler, now living in Canada, a man who had carried his own memories from that day like a quiet burden. And so, in 1990, after nearly half a century, the two men met again for the first time since the skies of 1943. Picture the moment. Charlie Brown, 68 years old. Franz Stigler, 75. They recognized each other instantly, as if time had been merely a thin veil between them. Franz confirmed every element of Charlie's account. He spoke of the code of honor, of Gustav Rodel's lessons, of the sight of those wounded men inside the dying B-17. For 47 years, he had carried a weight, not guilt for sparing them, but for all the other aircraft he had destroyed over the course of the war. Saving that American crew had reminded him that the pilots he fought were human beings, not faceless targets. From that reunion blossomed a profound friendship. They became as close as old comrades, even though they had once met only as adversaries in the sky. They traveled to air shows together, retold their shared story to audiences who could scarcely believe it, exchanged letters, and spoke by phone every week. Their bond held strong into their final years. Franz Stigler passed away in 2008 at the age of 92. Charlie Brown followed 8 months later at 87. Today, they rest not far from one another. Before his death, Franz told interviewers that sparing Charlie Brown's crew was the greatest action of his life. Charlie said Franz had become like a brother, and perhaps that is the heart of it. Franz's decision on December 20th, 1943, had nothing to do with ideology or politics. It was rooted in something far older and far deeper, the simple recognition of shared humanity. Even in the midst of total war, he risked court-martial, disgrace, even execution to protect 10 men he did not know and assumed he would never meet again. He gained nothing from it. In truth, he forfeited a great deal. The Knight's Cross he needed one more kill to earn never came. The acclaim prized in the military culture of the time slipped past him. But he kept his humanity intact. He followed the code Rodel had instilled in him, even when obeying it meant defying orders and endangering his own life. And this story reveals something broader about the culture of fighter pilots during the Second World War. Despite the propaganda, despite the fury of nations locked in total conflict, many pilots upheld an unwritten code of mutual respect. They saw themselves as warriors, not executioners. They understood there were limits, lines you did not cross if you wished to remain human. The friendship between Franz and Charlie after the war stands as proof that the spark of humanity they recognized in each other that day in 1943 was neither fleeting nor imagined. They came to understand that their true enemies had never been the men in the opposing aircraft. Their enemies were the circumstances, the vast machinery of war that had forced them into combat. What Franz Stigler did that day was deceptively simple. He looked at the men in the wobbling, torn-open bomber and truly saw them. He chose compassion over duty, and that single choice shaped the rest of both their lives.